In a dopamine-driven society that is overwhelmed, overstimulated, overly defensive, and dominated by unexamined, pleasure-seeking, reactive thinking, it becomes my question as to where our relation is to a form of higher thought that we refer to as critical thinking. This way of being, I will refer to as modern hedonism. And now, my intention is not to use hedonism in the classical philosophical term. It's more of a behavioral description of current culture's pursuit of pleasure maximization. We see it today as instant gratification, doom scrolling, brain rot, overstimulation, and the avoidance of discomfort. This way of being is conducive to the decay of all dimensions of within one's character. The salient dimension being most affected is the ability to critically think. What is critical thinking? To what end does thinking serve us? What does it mean to know thyself? What does it mean to know? Based on the title of this video, I think you'll see where I'm going with this. As I move forward, I'm going to give my own interpretation of who Socrates was, what he's done for Western civilization, and what the significance of the trial of Socrates within Plato's apology meant. Let's go back to the days of ancient Athens, when asking too many questions in a collective dreaming city could have gotten you exiled or worse. Alright, so for this section, forgive me if I say the names wrong. I will attempt to say them, but I am probably most likely not going to be saying their names right whatsoever. But so going forward, Socrates was an Athenian citizen born during the early years of Athens' ascendancy. Unlike many of the intellectuals of his era, he didn't come from an aristocratic family of statesmen or generals. His father, a stonemason, now forgive me if I say his name incorrectly, but I think it's Sophroniskis. Let me know if it's otherwise. And his mother was a midwife whose name was Phanerit. Okay, maybe let me know if I said those names incorrectly. But Socrates often referred to this parentage symbolically. He liked to describe himself as the midwife of souls, someone who helps others give birth to their own ideas rather than adhering to Socrates' own agendas that he might have. So Socrates' birth coincided with the height of Athenian democracy and the cultural flourishing that produced figures such as Pericles, Sophocles, Phidias, and many others during that time. I don't want to attempt another one. His adulthood, however, overlapped with the devastating Peloponnesian War, which was from 431 to 404 BCE, which brought about political instability, factionalism, and eventually the brief oligarchic tyranny known as the 30. Although Socrates participated as a hoplite in several military campaigns, hoplite is a form of infantry soldier, he didn't pursue public office, nor did he engage it really in any writing. Every word attributed to him is mediated through other authors, such as Plato and Xenophon, each of whom present him in a slightly different intellectual light. Despite his lack of publications, Socrates became one of the most recognizable figures in Athenian public life. He was often presented with being barefoot, often disheveled, wandering the agora. He engaged with Athenians from all walks of life: politicians, artisans, poets, sophists, and ambitious youths who were craving to know. And going forward, you'll hear me say the term sophist, and what a sophist is it's a person who back then had this form of rhetoric that was persuasive, but they also could have deployed, they could have shared their expertise. They could have shared education, knowledge, and it was someone that you basically pay to learn from. Socrates' method was consistent. Be persistent, ask precise questions until the person he was speaking with discovered inconsistencies within their own belief system. This approach of Socrates would eventually make him both revered and resented. He would be admired by young thinkers, but be disliked by public figures whose reputations really depended on appearing wise. Now, if you were to read Plato's Republic, for example, that's where you would definitely find Socrates using something that's just referred to as the Socratic method, otherwise known as the Elenchus method. And this is pretty much the centerpiece of Socrates' legacy, in that it's a form of inquiry that's used to cross-examine logical foundations of Socrates' interlocutor's claim. This method doesn't offer answers, it exposes contradictions. So a lot of times it functions by asking for a definition, such as, what do you think justice is? What, in this case, it's going to be, what is critical thinking? It examines those assumptions, identifies contradictions, demonstrates that the original claim lacks internal coherence, but at the very bottom of it, it encourages the speaker to revise their belief. The goal is never to humiliate the thinker. Rather, it's to cultivate that intellectual humility and the pursuit of a more accurate understanding of moral concepts. The Elenchus method is not meant to attack people. It attacks the unexamined assumptions. But because many people identify with their assumptions, Socratic questioning often feels personal, destabilizing, and even humiliating. So the second part that Socrates is well known for is his ethical focus. Unlike the natural philosophers that preceded him, such as Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, Parmenides, Socrates didn't focus on cosmology. He believed in understanding that the heavens were less urgent than understanding oneself. His central interest was virtue, such as courage, justice, moderation, piety. For Socrates, moral inquiry was the highest calling of human life. Now, the third part that he's well known for is his statement, I know nothing. That statement in himself is what reveres him as the wisest man of Athens. This phrase is commonly attributed to Socrates, though reconstructed from Plato rather than directly quoted. It summarizes his intellectual stance. Wisdom begins with the recognition of one's ignorance. Where one admits that they don't know, that's where wonder begins. The fourth part that I would recognize as what makes Socrates well known is his influence on Plato and Aristotle. The way that I understand Socrates' influence on Western thinking is that he was something like the father of Western thought. Plato took Socrates' method and expanded it into metaphysics, politics, and epistemology. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, systematized logic, ethics, biology, and more, carrying Socrates' way of thinking forward. Without Socrates, would there be a Plato? Without a Plato, would there be Aristotle? And without Aristotle, where would we be at in terms of Western intellectual tradition? And so now we'll turn to what Socrates did for Western civilization. Here I'll pose that I think it'll be difficult to overstate Socrates' influence on Western civilization, as many of the philosophical trends and educational styles that you'll find in the current world today are examples of Socratic thinking. So a first example that I'll put out there is that before Socrates, Greek thinkers studied the cosmos. They studied the elements of the universe. They studied the origins of the universe. They also studied abstract metaphysics. But when Socrates came along, he declared that these inquiries secondary to understanding human character. Because of him, ethics became the centerpiece of Western philosophy. The second point that I'll put out there is that I would think that he had established the model of philosophical dialogue. Before Socrates, philosophy was primarily speculative monologues. With Socrates in the picture now, philosophy becomes more dialogical. It is rooted in conversation, debate, and examination. It allows other perspectives that are open-minded to come in, and so that way we can reach a more common ground. The third point that I'll make here is that he introduced a sort of intellectual humility. By insisting he knew nothing, Socrates overturned Greek intellectual culture, which valued confident oratory and rhetorical persuasion. Simply put, he replaced persuasion with questioning. The fourth contribution I would say that he had delivered to the Western tradition is that he reoriented the meaning of education. What I mean by that is that for the ancient world, education was largely the transfer of skills or cultural norms. Socrates turned education into an internal transformation, a search for virtue, and the disciplined correction of one's own beliefs. The fifth contribution is that he became a martyr for free inquiry. His trial and execution set a precedent still discussed today, the tension between the state and the thinker, between popular opinion and philosophical truth. All right, so now we turn to the significance of the trial of Socrates. So during this time, Athens was reeling from the Peloponnesian War. The democracy had been overthrown by the 30 tyrants, then restored. But suspicion, insecurity, and resentment still ran high. And now it was within this climate that Socrates' constant questioning was seen not as wisdom, but as destabilizing. It came off as annoying. It came off as suspicious. So some of the charges that were placed on Socrates during this time was impiety. He was accused of not believing in the gods of the city at the time. He was accused of introducing new divine entities. He was accused of corrupting the youth, but these charges were nominal. The deeper cause was political frustration and cultural insecurity. The real cause was that Socrates was exposing ignorance. Socrates was embarrassing powerful men within public, such as politicians, rhetoricians, poets, generals. I mean, if you read Plato's first book within the Republic, you'll find an example where Socrates is debating Thrasymachus on the concept of power. When Athenians were vulnerable during this time, this line of questioning, it became intolerable. And so within Plato's Apology, Socrates claims that questioning is not harmful but beneficial, that the city becomes healthier when people examine their beliefs. In the Credo, Socrates refuses rescue, arguing that escaping would violate the laws he benefited from and undermine his own teachings about justice. And so when he drank the hemlock in Plato's Apology, he became the model of a philosophical integrity that has held for the next 2,400 years. The trial of Socrates was not a rejection of a singular person. It was a rejection of a method of thinking. So now I'll turn to what critical thinking is and where our relation is with critical thinking as of today. Critical thinking classically can be the involvement of examining assumptions, seeking clarity, analyzing arguments, detecting contradictions, identifying those biases that we might carry, and distinguishing knowledge from opinion. It's the willingness to revise one's beliefs. And Socrates was essentially the first figure within Western history to develop this form of methodology in examining one's beliefs. Critical thinking requires you to slow down. It requires you to tolerate the uncertainties that may come with examining one's assumptions and beliefs. Now, in a sense, Socrates embodied critical thinking. He questioned the powerful. He questioned himself. He questioned popular beliefs at the time. He dismantled bad arguments. He refused to accept unexamined truths. Critical thinking for Socrates is fundamentally an ethical task to avoid self-deception. Now, why do I think the trial matters in the context of critical thinking? Socrates was executed because he represented the dangers of free inquiry within a fragile society. His death demonstrates that critical thinking threatens complacency, that societies under stress suppress inconvenient questions, that democracy, without intellectual courage, turns on its questioners, that the refusal to examine beliefs leads to injustice. In short, the trial of Socrates shows what happens when a society becomes intellectually insecure. All right, so now the crucial question of where is critical thinking today? I mean, before we go on forward, I implore you to ask yourself that as well too. I mean, where do you think we are with critical thinking, that sort of slow, analytical, examining the unexamined beliefs? Where do you think we're at with that today? Today, we are fed with social media. We are fed with algorithmic content, dopamine-driven feeds, whereas ancient Athens at the time, they had the sophists who entertained with rhetoric. And today, we seem to have a lot more emotionalism over reason, a lot of that emotional-based reasoning rather than logical-based reasoning. Public discourse of today is increasingly mirroring the Athenian assembly during Socrates' time, such as there being loud voices, quick judgments, tribal loyalties, fear of dissent, and suspicion towards intellectuals. We are also faced with decline of meaningful dialogue. Socratic dialogue requires patience, vulnerability, and intellectual honesty. And these are becoming increasingly rare today. If you look back into Plato's Republic, for example, you'll find that whenever a person is speaking, I'm not even kidding, it's literally pages long of where they're examining all their beliefs, their assumptions, and it's something you don't see very much of today. There is also the revival of opinion over knowledge. Socrates warned that opinion, also known as doxa, is the enemy of wisdom, which is also known as Sophia. Today, we often mistake information for understanding and the belief for knowledge. And today, we have the avoidance of intellectual discomfort. Just as Athenians were tired of Socrates' gaffe-like questions, modern individuals of today are weary of the discomfort that follows deep inquiry. We haven't lost our connection to critical thinking, but it is becoming endangered through social media, through impatience, overstimulation, ego protection, algorithmic reinforcement, and the avoidance of uncertainty. But perhaps most dangerously is the belief that one already knows. And the reason I say that is that there are many with an immature, arrogant, and highly defensive ego that covets their knowledge as though it were the treasure hoard that belonged to a dragon. And let me stress here that it's not a sort of moral failure. It's more of a cognitive blindside, or maybe even failure in itself too. I think the misconception today is that to know does not mean to fully understand one thing in itself to the end of its nature. Knowledge is something like fixed mental representation of events, outcomes, and characteristics that occur within external reality and the psyche. Knowledge tends to crystallize into fixed representations, while reality continues to change. The danger arises when we confuse our representations for reality itself. Simply put, knowledge is static. Reality is not. Reality is constantly in flux. Alright, so now I'll provide a sort of synthesis with everything we've just spoken about. Socrates stands as a sort of beginning to the Western intellectual history because he did something extraordinarily rare. He made the pursuit of truth more important than comfort, reputation, and safety. His method, the Elenchus method, involves relentless questioning, and it became the foundation of logic, ethics, education, and scientific inquiry. Socrates' death remains one of the history's clearest warnings that a society that rejects critical thinking inevitably becomes vulnerable to error, injustice, and self-deception. A society that prioritizes comfort over truth will always sacrifice critical thinking. Socrates taught that the unexamined life is not worth living. Today, I think we are living in an unexamined culture. What do you think?